Racist officers destroyed a black courier's bicycle, depriving him of his only means of earning a living. So what happened next? Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this from. The first light of dawn crept through the worn-out blinds of the small apartment, illuminating the cramped but tidy living room. It was modest but functional, much like the man who occupied it. Jamal stirred in his bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as the sounds of the waking city filtered through the cracked window. He rose quietly, careful not to wake his wife, Nia, who had only just fallen asleep after working a late shift at the diner. Her exhaustion was evident in the way her hand limply rested on the edge of the bed, as if even her dreams carried the weight of their struggles. In the adjoining room, the soft murmurs of his two young daughters drifted out. They were already awake, whispering to each other, their tiny voices filled with the kind of hope only children could muster in a world like theirs. Jamal smiled faintly as he leaned against the doorframe, watching them through the sliver of light. Amara, the older one at 7, was braiding her little sister Layla's hair, a routine they had developed as a way to feel grown up in a life that often forced them to be. "Morning, Daddy," Amara said brightly when she caught sight of him. Layla echoed her small voice still thick with sleep. Jamal stepped into the room, crouching down to hug them both. "Morning, my little queens," he said softly, kissing each of their foreheads. "You two slept okay?" Amara nodded enthusiastically while Layla rubbed her eyes and asked, "Can we have pancakes today?" Jamal chuckled. Pancakes were a rare treat, reserved for the end of the month when tips and paychecks aligned just right. Today wasn't one of those days, but he didn't have the heart to say no outright. "How about I make the special oatmeal instead?" he suggested, "with cinnamon and a little honey?" Layla pouted for a moment, but eventually nodded, her big eyes still hopeful. Amara squeezed her father's hand knowingly. She was young, but already beginning to understand the unspoken struggles their family faced. Jamal left them to get dressed and headed to the kitchen, where the cupboards were sparse but sufficient. He measured out the oatmeal carefully, as if ensuring each grain would stretch further. The hum of the kettle filled the small space, mingling with the faint sounds of the city outside. As he prepared breakfast, his mind drifted to the day ahead. His shift as a delivery courier started in less than an hour, and the thought of the looming bills weighed heavily on him. The rent was overdue, and there was still the matter of Layla's school supplies. Every delivery he made felt like a step closer to keeping their heads above water, but the margin was razor thin. After breakfast, Nia stirred, joining the family at the table with a tired smile. Her hair was still tucked under the scarf she wore to work, and the lines of fatigue etched into her face told Jamal everything he needed to know about her shift. "You okay, baby?" he asked, reaching out to squeeze her hand. She nodded, stifling a yawn. "I'll manage. How about you? Big day ahead." Jamal shrugged. "Same as always. Just need to keep the wheels turning." It wasn't just a metaphor. His bicycle, a second-hand model he had painstakingly restored, was not only his means of transportation, but his lifeline. Every dollar he earned depended on its reliability, and he treated it with the kind of care reserved for family heirlooms. After breakfast, Jamal kissed his daughters goodbye, promising to bring them something sweet if his tips were good. He then stepped into the narrow hallway where his bike was parked, leaning against the peeling wall like a trusted friend. He crouched down to inspect it, checking the brakes, tightening the chain, and wiping the chain clean with a rag. His thoughts wandered as he worked. He remembered the day he'd found the bike at a local junkyard, its frame bent and rusted. It had been a project born of necessity, but as he repaired it piece by piece, it became a symbol of his resilience. When he finally rode it for the first time, it felt like reclaiming a small piece of dignity in a world that often stripped him of it. Satisfied with the bike's condition, Jamal swung his delivery bag over his shoulder and rolled the bike out onto the street. The morning air was crisp, and the city was alive with movement. Cars honking, vendors setting up their stalls, neighbors exchanging nods. As he pedaled through the familiar streets, the weight of the day ahead pressed down on him. He couldn't afford any delays or mistakes. Every delivery had to be on time to keep his customers happy and his earnings steady. The neighborhood was a patchwork of struggling families, small businesses, and worn-out buildings. Graffiti covered many of the walls, some of it beautiful, some of it angry. A mural near the corner of his block depicted a young boy on a bicycle, his face set with determination. It was a tribute to the resilience of their community, and Jamal often found himself drawing strength from it. He stopped briefly at the local deli to pick up a delivery order, exchanging pleasantries with the owner, Mr. Patel, who handed him the bag with a sympathetic smile. "Another busy day, eh, Jamal?" Patel asked. "You know it," Jamal replied with a grin, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Take care out there," Patel added. "And watch out for those cops. They've been cracking down hard on anyone they think doesn't belong." Jamal nodded, the warning lingering in his mind as he pedaled away. He had always tried to keep his head down, to avoid drawing attention. But in a city like this, where prejudice and power often collided, staying invisible wasn't always enough. As he navigated the bustling streets, weaving between cars and pedestrians, Jamal couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that today would test him in ways he wasn't prepared for. The first delivery went smoothly, as did the next two. By midday, Jamal had found his rhythm, his body moving in sync with the bike as if they were one. The sense of control, of purpose, was a rare comfort in his otherwise chaotic life. But as the sun climbed higher and the streets grew busier, the unease returned. At a red light, he noticed a police cruiser idling nearby. Two officers sat inside, their eyes scanning the street. Jamal didn't recognize them, but their presence was enough to make his heart race. The light turned green and he pedaled forward, keeping his gaze fixed ahead. The cruiser followed, its shadow looming over him like a storm cloud. Jamal tightened his grip on the handlebars, his mind racing with questions. Was this just a coincidence, or was it the beginning of something far more troubling? The day wasn't over yet, but already Jamal could feel the cracks forming in the fragile stability he had fought so hard to maintain. The day wore on as Jamal weaved through the streets, his mind focused on the demands of his job. The weight of his delivery bag pressed into his shoulders, but it was a familiar discomfort, one he had grown used to. He knew every shortcut and alley in this part of the city, every crack in the pavement that could send him tumbling if he wasn't careful. This was his domain, a chaotic, ever-changing labyrinth of traffic and pedestrians, where every second mattered. He had just dropped off an order at a corner cafe and was checking his phone for the next address when he noticed the police cruiser again. It was parked at the opposite end of the street, its lights off, but its presence impossible to ignore. The same officers he had seen earlier were inside, their eyes scanning the area. Jamal felt a twinge of unease, but told himself to stay calm. He wasn't doing anything wrong, he was just trying to earn a living. The next order was in a neighboring district, a slightly wealthier area where the streets were cleaner and the buildings taller. Jamal adjusted his bag and started pedaling. As he crossed the intersection, he glanced over his shoulder and saw the cruiser pulling out of its spot. His chest tightened. They were following him. Jamal kept his pace steady, resisting the urge to speed up. He focused on the rhythm of his pedaling, the feel of the handlebars under his hands, and the hum of the tires on the asphalt. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the cruiser's presence loomed behind him, an oppressive shadow that refused to let him go. At the next light, he stopped and placed one foot on the ground to steady himself. The cruiser pulled up beside him, its windows rolled up, but he could feel the weight of the officer's gaze. He stole a quick glance at them. Two white men, one with a shaved head and sunglasses, the other clean-cut, with a permanent smirk etched into his face. Their expressions were unreadable, but their eyes held a cold, calculating intensity. The light turned green, and Jamal pushed off, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned down a quieter side street, hoping to lose them in the maze of narrow lanes. But no sooner had he started pedaling than the sound of the cruiser's engine echoed behind him. They were still there. Panic began to creep in, but Jamal forced himself to stay composed. He wasn't doing anything illegal. He was wearing his reflective vest, his helmet, and he always obeyed traffic laws. He had nothing to hide. Yet the presence of the police made him feel as though he did. As he approached another intersection, the cruiser sped up and swerved in front of him, blocking his path. Jamal hit the brakes hard, his tires screeching against the pavement as he came to a stop just inches from the car. The suddenness of the maneuver nearly sent him flying over the handlebars. Before he could process what was happening, the driver's door swung open and one of the officers stepped out. It was the clean-cut one with the smirk, his badge glinting in the sunlight. "Hey, you!" the officer barked, pointing a finger at Jamal. "What's the rush?" Jamal stayed on his bike, his hands gripping the handlebars tightly. "I'm just working, officer. Delivering food." "Working, huh?" The officer walked closer, his boots crunching on the pavement. "You sure you're not causing trouble out here?" "Oh, sir, just doing my job." The second officer, the one with the shaved head, got out of the car and leaned against the hood, his sunglasses hiding his eyes. He crossed his arms and tilted his head, studying Jamal like a predator sizing up its prey. "Let's see some ID," the clean-cut officer demanded. Jamal hesitated. He had his work ID in his bag, but something about the situation felt wrong. He knew he had to comply, though, so he slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. The officer snatched it from his hand and flipped it open, examining the contents. "This all you got?" the officer sneered, holding up Jamal's driver's license and work badge. "Yes, sir," Jamal replied, keeping his voice steady. "That's all I need for my job." The officer tossed the wallet back at him, and it landed on the ground. Jamal bent down to pick it up, his hands shaking slightly. "You know," the officer said, stepping closer, "we've had reports of people riding around here causing accidents. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" "No, sir, I always follow the rules. I just deliver food." The shaved-head officer chuckled from his spot by the car. "That bike of yours looks like it's seen better days, that it's not even street legal." Jamal's stomach sank. "It's in good condition, sir. I maintain it myself." "Sure you do," the clean-cut officer said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He circled the bike, tapping the frame with his baton. "But it's missing a bell. That's a violation, isn't it?" Jamal opened his mouth to protest, but before he could say anything, the officer raised his baton and brought it down on the bike's rear wheel. The sound of metal bending echoed through the street. "Hey, stop!" Jamal shouted, stepping off the bike. The officer ignored him and struck the bike again, this time denting the frame. The other officer joined in, kicking the front wheel until it bent inward. Jamal watched in horror as his lifeline, the tool that allowed him to feed his family, was reduced to a pile of twisted metal and rubber. "What are you doing this?" Jamal's voice cracked with emotion. "I didn't do anything wrong." The clean-cut officer smirked. "Just making sure you're not a danger to anyone." Jamal's legs felt like jelly as he sank to the ground beside the wreckage of his bike. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away, refusing to let the officers see his pain. His hands hovered over the ruined frame, trembling as he tried to process what had just happened. The officers got back in their cruiser, laughing and exchanging smug comments as they drove away, leaving Jamal sitting alone on the side of the road. A few passers-by stopped to look, but quickly moved on, unwilling to get involved. Only one person, a young woman with a smartphone in hand, lingered. She crouched down beside Jamal, her voice soft but determined. "I recorded everything," she said. "This isn't right. I'll make sure people see what they did to you." Jamal looked up at her, his face a mixture of gratitude and despair. But as the sound of the cruiser's engine faded into the distance, one thought echoed in his mind. How was he going to keep his family afloat now? Jamal trudged home under the weight of despair, the remnants of his bicycle dragging behind him like a physical representation of his broken spirit. The once sleek frame was now a mangled heap of twisted metal and shattered rubber, its wheels bent beyond recognition. With every step, he felt the stares of passers-by. Some glanced at him with pity, others quickly looked away, as if unwilling to confront the injustice etched into his every movement. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the worn-out streets of the neighborhood. By the time Jamal reached the front steps of his apartment building, his legs felt like lead, and his chest ached from holding back tears. He paused at the door, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Inside, his family was waiting. He couldn't let them see him like this, not broken, not defeated. But the moment he stepped through the door, the sound of his daughter's laughter reached his ears, and the fragile dam holding back his emotions cracked. Layla and Amara were sitting on the living room floor, coloring pictures of houses with bright red roofs and golden suns. Nia was in the kitchen, her back turned as she stirred a pot on the stove. The scent of simmering beans and rice filled the air, a comforting reminder of home. "Daddy!" Layla exclaimed when she saw him, her eyes lighting up. She scrambled to her feet and ran toward him, arms outstretched. Amara followed close behind, her face beaming with excitement. Jamal forced a smile as he dropped the bike frame gently by the door and crouched down to hug them. "Hey, my little queens," he said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to hide it. He held them tightly, as if their small arms could somehow shield him from the weight of the day. "What happened to your bike?" Amara asked, her curious gaze shifting to the broken frame. Layla frowned, her tiny hands clutching his shirt. Before Jamal could answer, Nia appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. Her smile faltered when she saw the bike, her eyes narrowing in concern. "Jamal," she said softly, "what happened?" He stood up slowly, his body stiff from exhaustion and tension. "Not here," he murmured, nodding toward the kitchen. "Let's talk in private." Nia hesitated but nodded, ushering the girls back to their coloring books. "We'll be right back, okay? Daddy just needs to tell me something." The kitchen felt smaller than usual as Jamal closed the door behind them. He leaned against the counter, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the day finally pressed down on him. Nia crossed her arms, her brow furrowed in worry. "Tell me," she said, "what happened?" Jamal took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "The cops. They stopped me today. Said I was breaking the law, riding illegally. Then they destroyed my bike, smashed it to pieces." Nia's eyes widened in shock, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. She stared at him, her expression shifting from disbelief to anger and then to something deeper. Fear. "Why?" she finally managed. "Why would they do that?" "I don't know," Jamal admitted, his voice cracking. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I followed all the rules. They wanted to show me they could." Nia sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. That bike was everything, she whispered. It was how we paid rent, bought groceries. Jamal, what are we going to do? Her words felt like daggers, each one piercing the fragile resolve he had tried to maintain. He dropped into the chair across from her, burying his face in his hands. I don't know, he said, his voice muffled. I don't know what to do. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint bubbling of the pot on the stove. Then Nia reached out, placing a hand on his arm. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice steadier now. We always do. But you can't let this break you. You hear me? We can't afford for you to give up. Jamal looked up at her, his eyes red and glassy. He nodded slowly, though the weight in his chest remained. I feel so powerless. They can do whatever they want, and no one stops them. You're not powerless, Nia said firmly. You're here. You're alive. That's power, Jamal. They didn't take that from you. Her words struck a chord, igniting a small spark of resilience in the darkness. Jamal took a deep breath, trying to hold on to that spark as he stood up. You're right, he said quietly. I can't let them win. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Jamal and Nia exchanged a glance before Jamal went to answer it. Standing in the hallway was a young woman holding her phone. He recognized her instantly as the passerby who had witnessed the incident. Hi, she said, her voice tentative but determined. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to make sure you were okay. I recorded what happened earlier. Jamal blinked, his mind struggling to process her words. You recorded it? She nodded, holding up her phone. Every second. The way they treated you, it was wrong. People need to see this. Nia stepped into the doorway, her protective instincts kicking in. Who are you? She asked, her tone cautious. My name's Zoe, the woman replied. I work for a small media outlet. I wasn't on the clock, but when I saw what they were doing to him, I couldn't just walk away. Jamal hesitated, glancing at Nia. The idea of his humiliation being broadcast for the world to see made his stomach churn, but at the same time a flicker of hope stirred within him. Maybe this was a chance to fight back, to show the world what he and so many others endured. I don't know, he began, but Nia cut him off. Let her show it, she said, her voice firm. People need to know the truth. Zoe smiled faintly, relief washing over her face. I'll make sure it gets out there, she promised. And I'll keep in touch. If you need anything at all, just call me. She handed Jamal a slip of paper with her number on it before turning to leave. As the door closed behind her, Jamal felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The thought of standing up to the officers who had crushed him was terrifying, but the alternative, doing nothing, felt unbearable. Back in the living room, his daughters looked up at him expectantly. Are you okay, Daddy? Layla asked, her big brown eyes filled with concern. Jamal knelt down and pulled them both into a hug. I'm okay, baby, he said, his voice steady for the first time that day. We're going to be okay. But as he held them close, his mind raced with questions. What would come next? What consequences would he face for speaking out? And most importantly, how could he protect his family in a world that seemed determined to tear them down? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The next morning, Jamal woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. He groaned, rubbing his eyes as the early rays of sunlight streamed through the blinds. Nia stirred beside him, mumbling something incoherent before turning over to continue her sleep. The phone vibrated again, his persistent hum demanding attention. Jamal reached for it, his mind still foggy from the restless night. As he unlocked the screen, he was greeted by a flurry of notifications. Text messages, missed calls, and countless social media alerts lit up his phone like a beacon. His stomach churned with unease. What could possibly warrant this kind of attention? One name stood out among the notifications: Zoe. She had sent him a string of messages, the first of which read, "It's out. Call me when you wake up." Confused, Jamal clicked on the link she had included. It led to a video of him. His heart sank as he saw the familiar footage, the cruiser pulling in front of him, the officers stepping out, their mocking voices, and finally, the brutal destruction of his bike. The video captured every detail, from Jamal's protests to the officers' smug laughter as they drove away. Even the despair etched on his face as he knelt by the wreckage was on full display. The caption read, "Delivery driver's bike destroyed by police in shocking abuse of power." It had already been viewed thousands of times, with comments pouring in faster than he could read them. Some were expressions of outrage and solidarity. "This is disgusting. Those officers need to be held accountable." "How can anyone watch this and not be furious? Stay strong, Jamal." Others were more cynical, questioning his side of the story. "There's got to be more to this. What did he do to provoke them?" Just another case of someone playing the victim. Jamal's hands trembled as he put the phone down. He didn't know how to feel. Gratitude for the support, anger at the dismissive comments, or fear for what might happen next. Nia stirred again, this time sitting up and rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" she asked, noticing his troubled expression. Jamal handed her the phone. She watched the video in silence, her lips tightening with every second. When it ended, she looked at him, her eyes a mix of concern and determination. "This could be a good thing," she said cautiously. "People are paying attention. Maybe this will lead to justice." "Or it could make things worse," Jamal muttered. "What if the cops come after us for this? They already showed me what they're capable of." Nia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this. Look at the comments. People are on your side. We just have to be smart about how we handle this." Before Jamal could respond, there was a knock at the door. He tensed, his mind immediately jumping to the worst-case scenario. Nia stood and motioned for him to stay seated. "I'll get it," she said. When she opened the door, Zoe stood on the other side, holding a bag of coffee and pastries. She offered a small smile. "I figured you might need a pick-me-up," she said. Nia let her in, and Zoe set the bag on the kitchen table. Jamal stood awkwardly, unsure of how to address the whirlwind she had unleashed. "Why'd you post it so fast?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Zoe didn't flinch. "Because people need to see what's happening," she said firmly, "and it's working. Look at the response. News outlets are reaching out, activists want to support you. This is your chance to hold those officers accountable." Jamal ran a hand over his face, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "What if it's too much? I'm just trying to keep my family safe. This isn't what I signed up for." "I understand," Zoe said softly, "but staying silent won't protect you. Those officers won't stop just because you stayed quiet. They'll do this to someone else, maybe worse." Nia nodded, her voice steady. "She's right, Jamal. We've spent too long keeping our heads down, hoping things would get better. Maybe it's time to fight back." Before Jamal could respond, his phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Is this Jamal?" a voice on the other end asked. It was deep and professional with a hint of urgency. "Yes, this is Jamal," he replied cautiously. "My name is Eric Sanders," the man said. "I'm a lawyer with the Civil Justice Initiative. We saw the video and we want to help. If you're interested, we can discuss your options." Jamal glanced at Nia and Zoe, who were both watching him expectantly. I don't know, he stammered. I've never done anything like this before. That's okay, Eric said. We'll guide you through it. You don't have to decide now, but the sooner we act, the better. Jamal thanked him and hung up, his mind racing. The idea of taking legal action against the police was daunting, but the thought of doing nothing felt even worse. As the day went on, the video continued to spread. Local news stations picked up the story, and reporters began contacting Jamal for interviews. Activists reached out, offering to organize protests and rallies in his support. His once quiet life was now a storm of activity, and he felt like he was being pulled in a dozen directions at once. By the evening, Jamal sat with Nia and Zoe at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of it all. I just wanted to do my job, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I never wanted to be the face of anything. But you are now, Zoe said, and that's not a bad thing. You have a chance to make a difference not just for yourself, but for everyone who's been through this. Nia reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. Whatever you decide, we're with you, she said. But if you want to fight, we'll fight with you. Jamal looked at her, then at Zoe. He thought of his daughters, their innocent faces and bright smiles. He thought of the officer's mocking laughter and the sound of his bike being destroyed. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. Okay, he said. Let's fight. And just like that, the quiet delivery driver who had spent his life avoiding conflict became the unwilling center of a growing movement. Whether he was ready for it or not, the world was watching, and there was no turning back. By the next morning, the city was buzzing. The video of Jamal's encounter with the police had gone viral, not just locally, but nationwide. Social media platforms were flooded with comments, hashtags, and shares. News outlets had picked up the story, with headlines like, "Delivery workers' livelihood destroyed by police brutality," and "Outrage over video of officer misconduct sparks protests." For Jamal, this whirlwind of attention was overwhelming. He hadn't left his apartment since the video was posted, afraid of running into the wrong kind of attention on the streets. His phone buzzed constantly with messages of support, requests for interviews, and updates from activists. Nia did her best to filter through the noise, but even she looked exhausted by the sheer volume of it all. We have to start making decisions, Zoe said, sitting at their kitchen table. She had practically moved in over the past 2 days, bringing in updates from her contacts in the media and activist circles. People want to help Jamal. They're organizing protest rallies. This is your chance to make a real statement. Jamal sat across from her, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. I didn't ask for any of this, he muttered. I just wanted to do my job and take care of my family. I know, Zoe replied gently, but this is bigger than you now. People are listening, they're angry, and they're ready to act. The question is, are you? Nia placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. We can't change what happened, she said, but maybe we can make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. Isn't that worth fighting for? Jamal sighed, the weight of their words sinking in. He thought about the messages of support he had received. Strangers sharing their own stories of police harassment, other delivery workers thanking him for standing up. He thought about his daughters, the world they were growing up in, and the example he wanted to set for them. Okay, he said finally, I'll do it, but I need your help. I don't know how to do this on my own. You're not alone, Zoe said with a determined smile. We've got your back. The first protest was scheduled for the following afternoon. Word spread quickly through social media, and by the time Jamal and Nia arrived at the designated park, a crowd had already gathered. Jamal felt a mix of awe and anxiety as he looked around at the sea of faces, some holding signs with slogans like "Justice for Jamal" and "End Police Brutality." Others carried images of his ruined bike, a stark reminder of the violence he had endured. Zoe had arranged for several speakers to address the crowd before Jamal, including local activists and community leaders. Each of them spoke passionately about the need for accountability, the systemic issues that allowed incidents like Jamal's to happen, and the importance of standing together against injustice. When it was Jamal's turn to speak, he felt his legs tremble as he stepped up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on him. He took a deep breath, his mind racing with doubts. But then he thought of his daughters, their innocent faces, giving him the courage to speak. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves. "I'm not used to being in the spotlight. I'm just a delivery worker trying to take care of my family. But what happened to me isn't just about me. It's about all of us. Everyone who's ever been treated like they don't matter because of the color of their skin or the job they do." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, and Jamal felt a surge of confidence. He continued, sharing his story in vivid detail, from the moment the officers stopped him to the sound of his bike being destroyed. "I'm not here because I want revenge," he said. "I'm here because I want change. No one should have to go through what I went through. No one should have to explain to their kids why the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones we fear the most." By the time he finished, the crowd was chanting his name. Jamal stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and pride. Nia greeted him with a tight hug, whispering, "You did amazing." As the protests gained momentum, so did the backlash. The local police department released a statement defending the officers' actions, claiming they had been enforcing traffic safety regulations. The statement further accused Jamal of escalating the situation, a narrative that angered his supporters and fueled further protests. The backlash wasn't limited to official statements. Jamal began receiving anonymous threats, both online and in his mailbox. Messages like, "Drop this or else," and "You're making a mistake," left him on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder. One night, as he and Nia were putting their daughters to bed, there was a loud bang on their front door. Jamal's heart raced as he cautiously approached the peephole. Outside, he saw two men standing in the hallway, their faces obscured by shadows. "Who is it?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. There was no response, just the sound of footsteps retreating. When he finally opened the door, he found a piece of paper taped to it. In bold letters, it read, "Keep your mouth shut." Jamal's hands trembled as he crumpled the note. Nia joined him, her face pale with worry. "We should call the police," she whispered. "And tell them what?" Jamal replied bitterly. "That their own people are threatening us. They won't do anything." The incident only strengthened his resolve. He reached out to Eric Sanders, the lawyer who had offered to help, and began the process of filing a formal complaint against the officers. Eric assured him that they had a strong case, especially with the video evidence. As the days turned into weeks, the protests grew larger and more organized. The park became a hub for community members to share their stories and demand change. Activists distributed flyers, collected signatures for petitions, and coordinated with local media to keep the momentum going. Despite the threats and pressure, Jamal continued to speak out. He attended every rally, gave interviews, and worked closely with Eric to build their case. Each step was a reminder that he was no longer just a delivery worker. He was a symbol of resistance, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. But the pressure took its toll. Jamal found himself constantly on edge, unable to sleep or relax. He worried about his family's safety, about the toll this was taking on Nia and the girls. Nia remained his rock, offering unwavering support even as she struggled with her own fears. "You're doing the right thing," she told him one night as they sat on the couch, the girls asleep in their room. It's hard, but it's worth it. For them, for all of us." Jamal nodded, though the weight of it all still pressed heavily on his shoulders. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Too many people were counting on him, and too much was at stake. The protests became a nightly occurrence, each one drawing larger crowds and more media attention. Jamal stood at the forefront, no longer just a victim, but a leader. And as he looked out at the faces of those who stood with him, he felt a spark of hope, a belief that together they could make a difference. But even as the movement gained strength, the opposition grew fiercer. The officers who had wronged him weren't going down without a fight, and Jamal knew the hardest battles were yet to come. The night before the biggest protest yet, Jamal lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His nerves were frayed, his thoughts an endless spiral of anxiety and doubt. The rally was set to take place in the city's largest park, a space often used for public events and protests. Organizers were expecting thousands to attend, with more media coverage than ever before. It was meant to be a turning point, a chance to demand accountability on a scale no one could ignore. But for Jamal, the weight of it all was suffocating. He wasn't a politician or an activist by trade. He was just a man trying to make ends meet. Now, he was the face of a movement he never intended to lead. Nia reached out from her side of the bed, placing a hand on his chest. "You're going to be okay," she said softly, her voice breaking through the noise in his head. Jamal turned to her, his expression heavy with worry. "What if I mess up? What if this makes things worse?" "You won't," she said firmly. "You've already come so far. Look at what you've done. People are listening because of you." Her words steadied him, if only a little. Jamal took a deep breath and closed his eyes, willing himself to rest. Tomorrow was going to be the most important day of his life. The morning of the rally was chaotic. Volunteers bustled about, setting up a stage and sound system in the park's main square. Banners with slogans like "Justice for Jamal" and "End Police Violence" were strung between trees, and tables were set up to distribute flyers and petitions. Jamal arrived early with Nia and their daughters. He wanted them to see what was happening, to understand why this fight mattered. Amara and Layla held small handmade signs, their innocent enthusiasm a stark contrast to the serious tone of the event. "Daddy's a hero," Amara declared, holding her sign high. Layla nodded in agreement, her eyes wide with excitement. Jamal smiled at them, but the knot in his stomach tightened. He wished he could share their optimism. As the hours passed, the crowd grew. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the park, their voices rising in a collective chant. Jamal stood backstage, watching as speaker after speaker took the podium. Local activists shared their stories of injustice, painting a picture of a system that had failed too many for too long. When his turn came, Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He stepped onto the stage to a roar of applause, the sheer volume of it almost overwhelming. He scanned the crowd, taking in the sea of faces, and felt a flicker of courage. These people believed in him. They were counting on him. He gripped the microphone tightly and began to speak. "I never thought I'd be standing here," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves. "I never wanted to be in the spotlight. All I wanted was to do my job, take care of my family, and live in peace. But the system didn't let me. It didn't let me because of the color of my skin, because of the assumptions people made when they saw me on that bike." The crowd listened intently, their cheers punctuating his words. "When those officers destroyed my bike, they didn't just take away my livelihood. They tried to take away my dignity, my hope. But they didn't win. They didn't win because I'm still here, and so are all of you." The crowd erupted into applause, chants of his name echoing through the park. Jamal paused, his chest tight with emotion, before continuing. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's been told they don't matter. We're here to say no more. We're here to demand justice, not just for me, but for everyone who's been wronged by this broken system." As he finished, the crowd surged forward, their energy palpable. Jamal stepped back from the microphone, overwhelmed but invigorated. Nia met him as he left the stage, pulling him into a tight hug. "You were amazing," she said, her voice thick with pride. But the day was far from over. As the rally continued, a group of counter-protesters gathered at the edge of the park, their shouts clashing with the chants of the crowd. Police officers, stationed nearby to maintain order, began to move in, their presence amplifying the tension. Jamal noticed two familiar figures among the officers, Kerrigan and Miller, the same men who had destroyed his bike. His stomach churned as their eyes locked across the square. The officers' smug expressions made it clear they weren't there to protect the protesters. The rally organizers had warned about the possibility of police interference, urging everyone to remain peaceful. But as the officers moved closer, the atmosphere grew increasingly volatile. Jamal stepped forward, raising his hands to address the crowd. "Stay calm," he shouted. "This is a peaceful protest. Don't give them a reason to shut us down." His words seemed to resonate, and the crowd began to settle. But Kerrigan and Miller weren't done. They pushed through the protesters, their presence a deliberate provocation. Then Zoe appeared, her phone raised as she recorded the officers' actions. "Keep it on camera," she said, her voice steady. "They can't hide if the world is watching." The tension reached its peak when Kerrigan approached Jamal directly. "Think you're a big man now, huh?" he sneered, his voice low enough for only Jamal to hear. "You're making a mistake. This won't end the way you think it will." Jamal met his gaze, his anger tempered by resolve. "The only mistake was thinking you could get away with it." Before the confrontation could escalate further, Eric Sanders arrived with a small team of legal observers. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the officers, "I suggest you step back. Everything you're doing is being recorded, and any misconduct will be added to the case we're building against you." Kerrigan glared at him, but said nothing. After a tense moment, he turned and walked away, Miller following close behind. As the rally wound down, a wave of relief washed over Jamal. They had stood their ground, and the message had been heard, but the day wasn't without its revelations. Eric approached Jamal, holding a folder of documents. "We've been digging into Kerrigan and Miller," he said. "It's worse than we thought. There are other complaints against them. Excessive force, racial profiling, even theft. None of it stuck because the department covered for them. But with your case, we have a chance to bring it all to light." Jamal stared at the folder, a mix of anger and determination building within him. "Let's do it," he said. "Let's make sure they never do this to anyone else." That night, as Jamal and his family returned home, the events of the day played over and over in his mind. The rally had been a success, but the fight was far from over. The system they were up against was vast and deeply entrenched. But for the first time, Jamal felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but he wasn't walking it alone. Together they would see it through to the end. The morning after the rally, Jamal woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows. The familiar feeling of dread that had greeted him every day for weeks was absent. Instead, there was a strange calmness, a quiet that allowed him to breathe without the weight of impending disaster pressing on his chest. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the tide might finally be turning. Nia was already up, her movements soft and deliberate as she prepared breakfast in their small kitchen. The smell of frying eggs and toast filled the apartment, a comforting reminder of normalcy amidst the chaos. Jamal sat up, rubbing his face and glancing at his phone. A flood of notifications awaited him, as always, but this time he didn't feel the usual wave of anxiety. He opened a text from Eric Sanders, the lawyer who had become a cornerstone of their fight. "Great news! The evidence we've gathered against Kerrigan and Miller is compelling. The DA is considering filing charges. Call me when you're ready to discuss next steps." Jamal stared at the message, his thoughts swirling. The idea that these men, who had humiliated him, destroyed his bike, and threatened his livelihood, might actually face consequences, felt almost surreal. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and headed to the kitchen, where Nia greeted him with a warm smile. "Morning," she said, sliding a plate of eggs and toast toward him. "You look like you slept better." "I think I did," he admitted, sitting down and taking a bite. "Eric just texted. He says the DA might press charges against those cops." Nia's eyes widened, her face lighting up. "That's huge, Jamal. All the work you've been doing, it's paying off." Jamal nodded, though a part of him remained cautious. "It's a step, yeah, but we're not done yet. I want to make sure this sticks, that they don't just get a slap on the wrist." "We'll make sure of it," Nia said firmly, her confidence bolstering his resolve. Later that day, Jamal met with Eric at the Civil Justice Initiative's downtown office. The building was modest but professional, its walls lined with photos of past victories, smiling clients shaking hands with lawyers, community members holding up banners that read, "Justice Won." Eric greeted Jamal with a firm handshake and led him into a conference room where several thick files were spread out on the table. "We've got 'em," Eric said without preamble. "Between your testimony, the video, and the other complaints we've unearthed, the case against Kerrigan and Miller is solid. The department can't sweep this under the rug anymore." Jamal scanned the files, his pulse quickening as he read through the evidence. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct stretched back years, each one a story of pain and injustice. "How did they get away with this for so long?" Jamal asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Cover-ups, bureaucracy, and people too scared to speak out," Eric replied. "But your case has brought it all into the light. This isn't just about those two officers anymore. It's about the whole system that protected them." Jamal leaned back in his chair, the weight of it all sinking in. He had wanted justice for what they did to him, but now he saw the bigger picture. This was an opportunity to change more than just his own circumstances. "What happens next?" he asked. "The DA is preparing to file charges," Eric said, "and we're going to file a civil suit against the department for failing to hold them accountable. It'll be a fight, but we're ready." Jamal nodded, determination hardening his expression. "Let's do it." As the legal proceedings began to unfold, Jamal found himself thrust even further into the public eye. News outlets clamored for interviews, and supporters rallied around him, their energy fueling his resolve. At the same time, the opposition grew louder. Some accused him of seeking attention, of exploiting the situation for personal gain. One evening, as Jamal scrolled through social media, he came across a particularly vicious comment. "This guy's just another grifter looking for a payday. Bet he's loving all the attention." The words stung, but Nia, sitting beside him, placed a hand on his arm. "Don't let them get to you," she said. "You know the truth. That's all that matters." Jamal took a deep breath and nodded. She was right. The fight wasn't about him. It was about everyone who had been silenced, everyone who deserved justice but never got it. The turning point came a few weeks later when the DA held a press conference to announce the charges against Kerrigan and Miller. The officers were being charged with destruction of property, misconduct, and civil rights violations. The news sent shockwaves through the community, sparking celebrations among Jamal's supporters and outrage from those who continued to defend the officers. For Jamal, it was a bittersweet victory. The charges were a step in the right direction, but the fight wasn't over. The civil suit loomed ahead, promising to be a long and grueling process. One evening, as Jamal sat with Naya and the girls, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Zoe standing there, holding a set of keys and wearing a wide grin. "What's this?" Jamal asked, confused. "A little something from the community," Zoe said, stepping aside to reveal a used but well-maintained car parked on the street. "They pooled their money together to get you this. Said you needed something better than a bike." Jamal stared at the car, his chest tightening with emotion. I don't know what to say." "Say thank you," Zoe replied, "and keep fighting." Tears filled Jamal's eyes as he hugged her, overwhelmed by the generosity of strangers who had become allies in his fight. The final chapter of Jamal's journey unfolded in court, where the civil suit against the police department was argued before a packed courtroom. Eric presented a compelling case, detailing the years of misconduct by Kerrigan and Miller and the department's failure to hold them accountable. Jamal took the stand, his voice steady as he recounted the day his bike was destroyed. He spoke not just of the physical loss, but of the deeper pain, the humiliation, the fear, and the sense of injustice that had driven him to fight back. In the end, the jury ruled in his favor. The department was ordered to pay substantial damages, and Kerrigan and Miller were stripped of their badges. Months later, as Jamal drove his family to the beach in the car gifted to him by the community, he reflected on how far they had come. The journey had been painful, filled with moments of doubt and fear, but it had also been transformative. "Daddy, are we there yet?" Layla asked from the back seat, her voice filled with excitement. "Almost," Jamal said, glancing at Naya, who smiled back at him. As they arrived at the beach, Jamal watched his daughters run toward the water, their laughter filling the air. He took Nia's hand, his heart full of gratitude and hope. For the first time in a long while, the future felt bright, and though the fight for justice was far from over, Jamal knew he had found his purpose, not just as a delivery worker, not just as a father, but as a voice for change. Together, they had turned broken wheels into a movement that would keep rolling forward, unstoppable and undeniable. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video if it touched you, and be sure to check out the other stories on our channel. Each story is a step towards understanding and change.